Hey everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my full process for sketching a house. I would consider this tutorial excellent for anyone just getting started with drawing and sketching, or for those of you who are interested in getting started with urban sketching. I not only made sure to choose a reference photo of a simple house, but I also made sure that the photo showed an elevation view of this house. In my opinion, if you're just getting started with drawing houses and buildings of any kind, maybe little shop or coffee shop facades, starting with elevation view drawings or sketches is oftentimes best. And this is because with an elevation view of a building, you're only seeing one of its sides. It has a certain flatness to it because you're standing flat facing forward in front of one of the planes or sides of the building, usually at ground level, and it's like you're standing right in the middle of that plane that is in front of you. So you're really only able to see one of those sides, as opposed to when you're standing closer to one corner or end of the building, or when you're seeing the building from way closer to the ground or higher above the building. You're able to see more planes of that overall structure for the building, which requires a deeper understanding of 3D form and perspective. By the way, the term plane is simply a fancy word for side. So when you're working on elevation view sketches, you see flat shapes. It's easier to see all of these different parts of the building or the house as simple flat shapes such as squares, triangles, and rectangles, as opposed to other more challenging perspectives where, because you see two or more planes and there are more diagonals involved and all kinds of stuff like that, you need to have more of an understanding of 3D form and perspective in order to adequately create that sketch and make it look believable. Rectangles turn into rectangular prisms or cylinders. Squares turn into cubes. Triangles turn into triangular prisms, so it's no longer shapes, but forms. Remember that the difference between a shape and a form is that a shape is flat and two-dimensional, and a form is 3D and has volume to it. So if you're just getting started on your journey with drawing and sketching, I would recommend starting to develop your basic drawing skills, such as holding your pencil effectively for drawing, drawing lightly, start developing your observational skills, your ability to recreate proportions and shapes effectively on the page via trying to recreate flat shapes. And when you're ready, you can start transitioning into visualizing everything that you have around you as three-dimensional forms. So that's my advice for beginners. I am a huge believer in taking your learning journey incrementally, a step at a time, towards more challenging subjects or objects, because this is going to help you enjoy your journey much more and stay away from unnecessary frustration. All right, so with all that important information out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So these are the drawing supplies that I have on hand. I'm going to be working in my 9 by 12 inch sketchbook from Strathmore. I have a B grade drawing pencil, one of my pigment liners from Staedtler. This is in 0.3 tip size, and a couple of different erasers, a soft dust-free eraser from Faber-Castell and a kneaded eraser, which is that blue chewed up bubblegum looking thing on screen. Something I do want to mention is if you're just getting started with drawing, don't be afraid or feel shame for having to bring in a ruler. Drawing long straight lines is challenging and it requires practice. As you continue working on your basic drawing skills via basic drills, such as filling up sketchbook pages with different kinds of lines and shapes while holding your pencil effectively for drawing and using your entire arm, feel free to bring in a ruler to draw these straight lines, especially the longer ones. There is absolutely no shame in that, and as you continue practicing and developing your skills, you're going to find that you need your ruler less and less. In this tutorial, I'm going to be focusing way more on the freehand graphite drawing process, but I have lots of videos on pen and ink, full tutorials, tips, alternative shading techniques, and a whole bunch of things that you can check out to improve your pen and ink drawing skills. I'm going to make sure to leave links to a few of them down below in the description box in case you'd like to go and check them out. Also, if you want to join me for this sketching practice, I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can download the original reference photo that I used for this study. Okay, so let's get started with this drawing process. The very first thing that I do is I observe that reference photo and notice what the general shape of the house or building is. I always work from largest general shapes and make my way towards the smallest shapes and details. By doing this, I'm able to recreate proportions much better and utilize my drawing space a lot more effectively. So for this house, what I am seeing as the general largest shape first is a rectangle. It has greater height than it does width. And because it's an elevation view of this house, I see straight lines. I see straight horizontals and I see straight verticals making up that rectangle. So this large general rectangle is the first thing that I'm going to try to recreate freehand on paper. Now, as you continue drawing freehand, your observational skills will improve, and so will your abilities to recreate those shapes and proportions effectively. It's a matter of practice. Do what you can to recreate this rectangle with similar proportions to what you're seeing in that reference photo, but if your proportions are slightly off, it doesn't matter. This will improve over time. And just so you know, even in my sketch, there are slight differences in proportions and I changed some things. It's not really my intention to get every single little thing identical to what I see in the photo. I'm just using that photo as loose inspiration so that I can get this practice in. Okay, so having noticed that basic general largest shape, what I am doing right here is I am using my B pencil to start recreating that large rectangle on paper. I am doing my best to keep my horizontal lines and my vertical lines as straight as possible, and I am guiding myself with the edges of my paper. Because I know that those edges of my paper are perfectly straight, I am using them as guides as I am laying down these lines. Feel free to use a ruler for these lines. By focusing on getting in this large rectangle first and really tuning out all the other things that don't matter right now, I am already starting to get in those major macro level proportions for the house, but I'm also utilizing my drawing space effectively because I'm making sure to place this large rectangle relatively centered within my paper. I will be adding in an electricity post on the left, which is why I'm leaving more space on the left, but I'm making sure that it is relatively centered and it has a relatively good size. I can make sure that my drawing is not going to be too small or too large that it'll end up not fitting on my page. All right, so after getting in that rectangle, the next thing that I draw are those ground lines. I see a bit of a slanted line in that bottom edge for the sidewalk in the reference photo. So I try to get that angle in as best as I can. I like that slight diagonal because it adds asymmetry and interest to the piece. Something I like constantly doing along the way is using my fingers to measure out heights and widths. I'm going to be constantly comparing heights and widths of different elements and shapes that I start adding into my drawing constantly throughout the process. Feel free to use your hand or even your drawing pencil to measure out sections as you go. It is essential to continue comparing and contrasting lengths, widths, overall dimensions of these different shapes with each other, and also compare their location inside of that larger shape, how close this shape is to the edge compared to this other shape, and things like this constantly along the sketching process. Remember that getting proportions right is about getting the relationships between the different parts making up the whole right. And in order for you to get those relationships in right, you need to constantly be comparing. I'm continuing to draw lightly in order to be able to erase mistakes and refine my drawing as I go. Okay, so I have my largest general shape in, and I have my ground lines there already established. So it is time to move on to breaking up this large shape into medium-sized areas. So when it comes to this particular house, what makes sense for me to do next is to separate out the top section of the house with the 2 windows from the bottom section of the house to break up this larger shape into medium-sized shapes. And what I notice in that reference photo is that that top section where the 2 windows are takes up approximately a third of the entire height of the larger shape. So that's where I place my horizontal line. The next thing that you're gonna see me do is I'm gonna add in a plumb line. Plumb lines are usually vertical lines, but they can also be horizontal lines that we add in as guidelines as artists in order to get alignments right and to get a little bit of a guide to place shapes and elements in their appropriate locations in space. So at any point in time, whenever you might find it helpful to add in either a vertical line or a horizontal line as guidance, please go ahead and do it. Just make sure to add your plumb lines in lightly so that you can erase them later. When it comes to sketching houses and buildings, there are many different elements that require alignment most of the times. Like, for example, windows are aligned, sometimes doors, and other architectural elements need that alignment. And by pulling a horizontal line or a vertical line sideways or downwards, that can be incredibly helpful for you when you're looking to align doors and windows and all that kind of stuff. And another huge tip for you is a lot of the times there is some amount of symmetry in the house or building design, meaning the left and right halves are somewhat mirrored, or if you were to fold that house in half, the left side would be identical to the right side, at least in certain portions of the house. And because of this, dividing that larger rectangle shape into 2 halves by placing a vertical right down the middle of that large rectangle, that is incredibly helpful. And this is why I created that vertical plumb line going right down the middle of the house, dividing that larger rectangle into left and right halves. And once I had that plumb line in, I was much more easily able to start drawing those smaller rectangles for the windows. I was much more easily able to get in those locations right for those windows and also those alignments and those sizes. And now you can see how after I placed those 2 windows at the top, I pulled down 2 more vertical plumb lines coming down from that top window on the left so that I could get that alignment correct for the window beneath it. Once I had that window in, it was time to start adding in that shape where I would be drawing the door. And I just asked myself, well, what lines would be helpful for me to add in so that I can have guides that I need for this door to be in the appropriate location and also for it to have a size that is similar to what I'm seeing in that photo. Which elements that I already have on the page can help me get the location and the size of this new element in as best as possible. And I noticed that the right edge of that general doorway shape is close to the middle of the window above it. So the first line that I brought down was a vertical guideline or plumb line starting right in the middle in the window above the door. I then laid down my horizontal for the top edge of that doorway, observing the distance between the bottom edge of the window above the door and the top edge of the doorway in the photo. And that's the way that I move forward. I continue creating lines for myself, measuring things out and comparing, simplifying everything into basic shapes and tuning out everything that doesn't matter right now. The more shapes or elements you start adding into your drawing, the more points of comparison you start having, which means that you have more shapes or lines to relate other shapes or lines with or to. and you can start noticing mistakes that need to be fixed. This is totally normal. Continue observing that reference photo and comparing it to your drawing. And if something looks off or you need to refine anything, go ahead and do it before moving forward. Okay, so here you can see how I placed 2 long vertical lines that are going to help me add in this beautiful section in front of the house that is kind of coming forward, that has 2 groups of 3 windows. 3 of them are in the first floor of the house and the other 3 are in the second floor of the house. I once again started by placing those 2 vertical lines where I thought it would be appropriate, observing the edges of this section that is coming forward in that reference photo. Use the lines that you've already laid down. Use the edges of that large rectangular shape that you started with, and also that vertical line that is dividing this larger rectangle in 2 equal halves, and all of the other elements that you've already laid down. And after placing those vertical lines, I started developing the horizontal lines and the angled lines that I saw there. Now that my largest shapes and my medium-sized shapes are in, you can see how I'm starting to draw in more complex shapes that have different angles. In some cases, I'm observing those angles that I see in the reference and trying to make them happen to the best of my abilities. One super helpful tip when it comes to drawing triangles like the one on top of the door is, if you want that top point of the triangle to be centered, use another vertical line to divide that rectangular shape that you're going to be adding the triangle into. Divide that rectangle into 2 equal halves with that vertical plumb line, and then draw the triangle using that as a guide. With that vertical right in the center of that rectangle, it's a lot easier to draw that triangle and get that top point centered exactly where you want it. There are a lot of interesting slants and angles in this section in front of the house with the groups of windows that is coming forward a little bit. And there is definitely some understanding of perspective that comes into play when drawing this section that is coming forward, especially because both of these groups of windows have a little kind of section of roof right above them, which, much like an awning of any kind, they have diagonals to them. And we have to pay attention to how the angles of these diagonals change, because they are not all the same. Those slanted lines and diagonals, they change in relation to our vantage point, or where we're standing in relation to the structure that we're observing. Always consider your vantage point. Where are you standing in relation to the structure? What is your eye level in relation to the structure? And what sections of the house or planes of these different structures making up the house are above your eye level, and which planes are below your eye level? Because this is going to have an impact on the diagonals that you see. So as I mentioned previously in the video, with this elevation view of this house, we're standing at ground level, a little bit of a distance away from the house, but we're standing at ground level. So my eye level would be somewhere around what I am pointing out right here with this red arrow. Here on the right, I'm going to quickly sketch out these lines just so that I can explain this to you more clearly. Notice how the diagonal section or the slanted sections on either side of the line at the top and the line in the bottom, they are different, they change. The ends of the line at the top are tilting downwards, that slant is going down, and the ends of the line in the bottom, they are tilting upwards, they are going up. This is what's happening in the photo, and of course I tried to recreate that in my drawing. And this happens because those angles change, again, depending on whether they are at my eye level, or above my eye level, or below my eye level. If you're looking at something that's right flat in front of you, and you're looking at it at eye level, you're going to see straight lines, especially if that structure is made up of flat planes. But the further above you have something, or the further below you have something from your eye level, those angles, the lines and the shapes that you see, they will change. The lower things get below my eye level, the more dramatic, the more sloped that angle is. And the same thing happens with the diagonals that are above my eye level. The higher above me these are, the more pronounced and slanted those angles become. So do try to pay attention to those angles and how they change in that reference photo, and just try to make those happen to the best of your abilities in your drawing. And as you continue progressing your knowledge on 3D form and perspective, these things will become much more easy for you to understand and much more easy for you to pinpoint in whatever reference photo you have that you're working with, or whatever you have in front of you in real life that you're trying to sketch. Okay, we're now at a point in which our largest shapes have been added in. They have been divided into medium-sized areas, and the medium-sized shapes have been added in. And it is now time to start working on the smaller shapes and smaller details. If you have done everything right until this point, proportions look right, and the medium-sized shapes have been added in appropriate locations, then the next step of the process should be the easiest. It's relatively easy to add in the smallest shapes and details in their correct locations, and this is because you are using the shapes and lines that have been already added into your drawing as guides to sketch in those smallest shapes freehand inside of them or alongside them. This doesn't require as much comparing and contrasting and getting sizes right or anything like that, because all of the shapes and lines are already there for you. So right here, for example, I'm just drawing another line on top of that line that I already have. In this case, I'm creating a slight diagonal, trying to notice that angle that I see in that reference photo, but I'm using that bottom vertical line that I had already created for that general rectangular shape as guide. Wherever I see shapes that have diagonals or slanted lines in that photo, I just try to recreate those angles to the best of my abilities. I don't spend too long on them, especially if they are smaller shapes and smaller details, but I do always bring to mind what I was mentioning in terms of where my vantage point is in relation to the house and how this might create slight changes in those angles. Notice how when it comes to the windows, I'm really just using the lines that I've already laid down for myself as guides, and I'm just creating a smaller shape that's exactly the same as that larger shape inside of it. Because these lines and shapes are much shorter and smaller than the lines and shapes that we were creating before, they are easier to draw. Now, I personally will be taking this sketch forward and doing some pen and ink work after finishing with my graphite work. So I will be adding in extra details and textures using my pen, and I am keeping everything relatively simple and really only adding in the shapes and lines that I feel I need in order to move forward with the next step of the sketching process, which is the pen and ink phase. But there is no right or wrong here if you will be moving on to pen and ink the way that I am, and you want to add in extra details with pencil so that you can already have them there and simply trace over them with your pen. That's perfectly fine as well. It's totally up to you and what you feel will be most helpful for you. All right, so I'm all done with my pencil sketch for now. I'm still going to be adding in that electricity post to the left of the house, and I'm going to do that with pencil first to make sure that I like it, because I'm going to be adding it in from imagination, and then I'm going to go ahead and do my pen and ink work on that electricity post, but that is later. But you just saw me a moment ago do a little bit of lightening of that graphite using my kneaded eraser. I just gently tapped over my drawing to lighten up my sketch a little bit and get rid of any excess graphite that might be floating around on my paper, which may lead to smudging as I am moving my hand over my drawing while working with my pen. All right, so I'm not going to be going too much in depth into the pen and ink techniques that I like using, or how I do hatching, how I make sure to develop line weight variation, etc., because I've created full videos on this in the past, and I go much more into depth into these things in other pen and ink videos. So make sure to check those out. I'm going to link to them below if you're interested. But I will say that my objective for this part of the process is to define edges, to add more details and textures. And I'm also going to be adding in some hatching for development of darker values inside of the windows. So hatching is an alternative shading technique that I've explained before. I think developing darker values inside of the windows will be a great addition to this piece. It will create more contrast between lighter value areas and darker value areas, and it'll make the piece more interesting. I do take artistic liberties for this part of the process. I'm going to be changing certain details and so on. And mostly with pen and ink, what I have in mind is making sure that as I am doing all of these things, I am staying away from flatness and heaviness. I have line weight variation in mind, which is essential, especially if you're looking for looser sketches and you want to stay away from stiffness. Line weight variation means that you have certain sections of your lines that look thicker and darker and heavier, and other sections of your lines that look lighter and thinner. And to do this, I make sure to keep it moving. I don't allow myself to get stuck in any single area. I embrace any wobbles and imperfections that happen. I make sure to change the angle at which I'm using my pen. So sometimes it's more of a 90-degree angle in relation to my paper. Other times it's more of a 45-degree angle. Other times it's more of a 30-degree angle, etc. And I also shift and change the pressure that I'm exerting on my pen. All of these things can have a great impact on how much ink is flowing down that tip of your pen. The more ink that flows down, the heavier and darker your line is likely to be. The less amount of ink flows down, the lighter and thinner and sometimes even broken your line is going to appear. And really in my mind, instead of seeing all these lines as outlines, I'm just seeing the work that I am doing initially as defining some edges. The moment that I start thinking of these lines as outlines, that is more likely going to lead to flatness and heaviness, especially if you create thicker outlines, more stark looking outlines. That leads to flatness and to more of a cartoony or coloring book page kind of look. So if you notice, a lot of these lines that I'm creating along the edges, they're not even connecting. And as I said, I'm keeping it moving, keeping it flowing. If you move too slowly or hesitate, that is going to make more ink come down the tip of your pen, and it's going to lead to heavier, thicker, more stiff lines. And you can even end up with stop and start marks, little dots along your lines if you stop at a certain point. I give thought to which lines or marks I want lighter and thinner, and which lines or marks I want heavier and darker and more prominent. So for the most part, the outer edges of my shapes have a little bit of a heavier line weight, generally speaking. And for example, these lines and marks that I start adding in for textures inside of these larger shapes, I add them in even more quickly and with less amount of pressure and using an angle that is going to allow me to create thinner, lighter lines. I'm going to change the design or the texture that I'm going to be using for this upper third part of the house. I decided to go in and add in little loose kind of rectangular shapes. These are more like marks because I'm not even closing the shape, but I really like the look of bricks or stone like that. So I change that, and as I am adding in this kind of detail or visual texture, I make sure not to go overboard with these little shapes or lines that I create. It's very easy to just go overboard and start adding and adding and adding, but less is really more, I think, especially with this kind of sketch. And when I'm adding in this kind of detail, I also make sure that I add it in a very irregular way. I want to stay away from patterns or anything that looks too organized. Okay, so right around here, I'm gonna get started with adding in that electricity post on the left of this house. And I just looked up a few electricity post photos on Google and got ideas, and I just started sketching that in from imagination. After having sketched in some shapes that looked good to me, I then brought out my pen again to define these shapes and add in those electricity lines above the house. I saw some electricity lines in the photo, but I didn't like their size and their location in relation to the house, which is the focal point of this piece. I thought they were kind of obstructing there, and I just wanted to change them so that they actually added to the piece and didn't take away. And this is what I talk about in that video that I shared on how it's important not to just take a photo and copy it, but it's important to bring in yourself into the piece and subtract things, add things, change things, as long as you think that it'll add to the composition and make it look better in a drawing or painting. I'll make sure to leave a link to that video down below in the text section of this post so that you can learn more about that. And just to finish up, I'm adding in my hatching right here inside of these windows. I made sure not to add hatching in every single window because I think it makes it look more interesting and it adds to the asymmetry present. And I added in my hatching in other shadow areas right below roofs and other elements in the house that are kind of sticking forward and creating a little bit of a shadow because they are impeding that light from hitting that section of certain planes beneath it. All right, so after finishing that up, I allowed everything to dry completely for around 10 to 15 minutes. The ink in these pigment liners from Staedtler dries pretty fast. I've never had any issues with it smudging so far, but make sure that everything is completely dry before erasing out any graphite work that you can see through your drawing pen. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.